Dallas, Texas eased into the early work week with sunlight piercing through the towering glass panels of Frostwell Industries, one of the largest tech firms in the region. Amid the stream of suited professionals hurrying across the marble lobby floor, a black man moved quietly through the ground-level hallway. He wore a faded navy blue uniform shirt, scuffed shoes worn thin from countless shifts, and clutched a brown envelope with frayed edges in his hand. His name was Elijah Brooks, 34 years old, and he'd been the building's janitor for the past 4 years. Elijah had never arrived late, never complained about overtime, and never caused an incident that drew attention. He was the kind of person employees nodded at in passing if they noticed him at all. He emptied trash bins after everyone had left for the day, scrubbed floors while the company slept, and faded into the background of a world dominated by ties and white collars. But this morning, his eyes held something different. Not the usual quiet resignation, but a storm brewing beneath the surface, pent up from years of being overlooked. As a black man in Dallas, Elijah was accustomed to invisibility. In this building, white employees often glanced past him with subtle suspicion, as if his presence alone warranted caution. Once a young engineer had called him the cleaning guy, without bothering to learn his name, even though Elijah had wiped down his desk hundreds of times. Discrimination wasn't always loud. It was in the small gestures, the way people avoided standing too close in the elevator, or how he was subjected to stricter ID checks than his white counterparts. Elijah lived in a rundown suburb supporting his ailing mother with heart issues and his younger sister scraping through community college. Each month, he sent money home, cutting corners everywhere, no coffee runs, no lunches out. Just homemade meals in a Tupperware container. His life was a loop, waking at 4 a.m., walking 4 miles to work, and returning home in the dark. But for the past 3 months, Elijah hadn't slept well. Nights were haunted by a mistake that cost the company a major deal, leading to layoffs and budget cuts that hit his fellow low-wage workers hardest. He felt like a betrayer, even though no one knew. And the envelope in his hand was his atonement. Inside were all his wages from those 3 months, every $100 bill saved by skipping bus fares and meals. Elijah paused outside Donald Reese's office, the operations director, a white man known for his harsh demeanor and quick firings. Without knocking, Elijah stepped in, placed the envelope on the desk, and nodded respectfully. "I'm returning my salary for the past 3 months, sir." Elijah said, his voice calm but resolute. Donald looked up from his computer, frowning. "What are you talking about, Elijah Brooks? I'm the one who caused the incident that lost Frostwell the contract with Copernico Logistics 3 months ago. I didn't speak up then. I don't deserve the pay. So, I'm giving it back." The room fell silent, the kind where you could hear a pin drop. Donald sat motionless, staring at the envelope like it was an unexploded bomb. A black janitor, returning his salary. This didn't fit any script he'd ever encountered. 3 months earlier, on a quiet Friday night, the Frostwell building had emptied out, leaving only the golden glow from the CEO's office and sensor lights flickering along the deserted hallways. Elijah was mopping the top floor, a space he rarely drew notice in except when something needed cleaning. As a black janitor, he was used to blending into the background. His white colleagues had long since headed home to their weekends while he pushed through another late shift to make ends meet. On the desk in the CEO's office, a briefcase lay open, revealing a thick stack of papers marked "Confidential Copernico Contract." A deal worth $25 million. Elijah hadn't touched it. He was just wiping down the surfaces nearby. But then he spotted a half-full coffee cup, teetering precariously close to the documents, a dribble of liquid already inching toward the pages. His heart quickened. He knew the consequences if those papers got ruined. In his position as a black man, often first in line for blame and mishaps even without evidence, he couldn't afford to let it happen. He reached for a paper towel to blot it away, but in his haste, exhausted from the long day, his hand slipped. The cup tipped over. Hot coffee spilled across the desk, soaking into the contract. Signatures blurred, clauses dissolved in a mess of ink and liquid, turning key sections into an unreadable smear. Elijah's stomach dropped. He grabbed more towels, frantically dabbing at the pages, even rushing to the nearby bathroom for a hairdryer to salvage what he could. The acrid scent of burnt coffee mixed with wet paper filled the air, a sharp reminder of past jobs where he'd been scapegoated for less, fired once after a missing item was blamed on him simply because he looked suspicious. But no matter what he tried, the damage was irreversible. When he finally left, the contract was partially destroyed, and Elijah felt a wave of guilt crash over him like the spill itself. The next morning, chaos erupted in the executive meeting. The CEO discovered the ruined documents just before the final review with Copernico Logistics. Partners pulled out immediately, citing unprofessionalism costing Frostwell the massive deal. Elijah lingered outside the door, overhearing the furious voices. This was our biggest contract of the year. Who's responsible? He knew the answer was him, but fear gripped him. Fear of losing his job, of being labeled unreliable because of his race, of failing his family who depended on his paycheck. No one suspected the black janitor. After all, who would think the invisible cleaner had access or motive? The investigation focused on executives and interns, overlooking the maintenance staff entirely. But the silence gnawed at Elijah. He watched the internal emails about budget cuts roll and saw colleagues, many people of color like him, laid off as the financial hit rippled through the company. He pictured the security chief's kids waiting for their dad at shift's end, now facing uncertainty because of his mistake. Sleep evaded him. Nights were spent replaying the spill, questioning why he hadn't spoken up. From that day, Elijah slashed his already meager expenses, walking the 4 miles to work instead of taking the bus, packing plain rice and beans for lunch, skipping any small comforts. Every paycheck, he set aside portions in the envelope, building a fund of restitution. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming his integrity in a world that often stripped black men of their dignity without a second thought. No one knew of his torment until that morning when he decided to step forward and face the consequences. After Elijah left Donald's office, the operations director remained frozen in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of the heavy envelope. It wasn't the money that unsettled him, though the stack of bills inside represented a janitor's quiet sacrifice, but the sheer audacity of the act. In a career built on firing people for minor infractions, Donald had never encountered someone like Elijah, a black janitor voluntarily confessing to a mistake that could have stayed buried forever. He initiated an internal investigation, immediately pulling footage from the security cameras 3 months back. Sure enough, as Elijah had described, no one had witnessed the spill. The man could have kept silent, collected his paychecks, and faded back into obscurity. But he hadn't. The next day, Donald escalated the matter to the 50th floor of the executive suite housing CEO Alyssa Merrick's office. Alyssa, a Latina woman in her late 40s, was known for her no-nonsense leadership, having clawed her way to the top despite facing her own share of gender and ethnic biases in the male-dominated tech world. She read the report silently, her eyes lingering on the envelope's contents before setting it aside. Did he ask for anything? she inquired, her voice measured. "Nothing," Donald replied. "Not a single word." Alyssa stood, her gaze drifting to the city skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows where skyscrapers symbolized economic power but often masked the inequities below. As someone who'd experienced discrimination being overlooked in meetings for her accent or heritage, she recognized the rarity of Elijah's honesty in a system that disproportionately punished people of color for far less. "Has the press caught wind?" she asked. "Not yet. Keep it that way. I want to meet Elijah first, alone." The following morning, Elijah was mopping the ground floor as usual, erasing the day's footprints from the marble without anyone sparing him a glance. A white security guard approached one who'd often eyed him suspiciously in the past and cleared his throat. "The CEO wants to see you. Up on 50. Elijah paused, his mop handle still in hand. He wiped his palms on his uniform, straightened his collar, and stepped into the elevator, a space he'd never ventured to the top floors before, as janitors like him were confined to the lower levels. The ride up felt eternal, the mirrored walls reflecting his worn uniform amid the polished chrome. Discrimination in the workplace wasn't always explicit. It was in the unspoken rules that kept black employees like him out of sight, their contributions invisible, until something went wrong. The doors opened to a world of gleaming walnut floors, crystal chandeliers, and suited executives who barely registered his presence, another subtle erasure, as if his uniform rendered him non-existent. A young assistant greeted him curtly and led him to the CEO's office. Alyssa stood by the glass wall, turning as he entered. She looked him directly in the eye. No pity, no condescension, just genuine attentiveness that contrasted sharply with how others typically regarded him. "Mr. Brooks," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I've read the report. I have to ask, why didn't you stay silent? You could have kept your pay. No one suspected you. You wouldn't have lost a thing." Elijah sat, his hands folded in his lap, meeting her gaze without flinching. "But I would have lost myself," he replied steadily. "As a black man, I'm used to being overlooked, doubted, blamed first for things I didn't do. But I couldn't let my mistake cost others their jobs, people like me who already get hit hardest by cuts. Keeping quiet would have eaten me alive." Alyssa held his words for a long moment, nodding, as if recognizing a shared truth in the systemic biases that affected both of them. She'd fought similar battles, being dismissed in boardrooms because of her background, her ideas credited to white male colleagues. Elijah's choice stood out in a corporate culture where self-preservation often trumped integrity, especially for those at the bottom. She rose and extended her hand, a gesture of equality that felt profound in its simplicity. Elijah shook it firmly. "Elijah Brooks," she said, her voice warm with respect. "I've never said this to anyone in your position before, but Frostwell is damn lucky to have a man like you." Elijah nodded, a quiet relief washing over him, though he knew this confrontation was just the beginning of something larger. The storm he'd held inside for months had finally broken, and the air felt clearer for it. 1 week later, in a company-wide internal meeting, held in the expansive auditorium of Frostwell's headquarters, CEO Alyssa Merrick took the stage herself to recount Elijah's story. There were no cameras, no press releases, just the employees who'd passed him in the halls for years now sitting in stunned silence as she detailed his confession. She emphasized how Elijah, a black janitor often rendered invisible by societal biases, had chosen honesty despite the risk of losing everything, subtly critiquing the racial discrimination that kept people like him in vulnerable positions, overlooked for promotions first in line for blame. The room grew heavy with reflection. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing their own complicity in ignoring the maintenance staff. The story didn't stay contained. It spread like wildfire through whispered conversations and private messages. A young white engineer, one who'd once brushed past Elijah without a second glance, posted a summary on LinkedIn, including a photo of the envelope and Elijah's poignant words, "I couldn't let my conscience sleep easy if I stayed silent." The post went viral overnight, garnering over 8 million views in 3 days, spilling onto Twitter and Facebook. Hashtags like Numrich Honest Janitor and Shaun Silent Integrity trended, with users sharing their own tales of workplace inequities, especially in the Black community, where stories of being undervalued resonated deeply. Major outlets caught wind. CNN ran a segment titled "Black Janitor Quietly Returns Salary and the Story Shaking Corporate America," while NBC and Time magazine followed with features on "No cameras, no witnesses, but he chose to speak up anyway." The narrative struck a chord, highlighting racial biases in corporate hierarchies, how Black workers like Elijah were often unseen until they erred, yet his act of integrity flipped the script. Frostwell's phones rang off the hook with interview requests, but Alyssa held firm. This isn't about publicity, it's about doing right by him. The company decided on a modest recognition event, but Alyssa pushed back. "Elijah doesn't need a plaque," she said in a strategy session. "He needs real opportunity to make up for the injustices he's endured." Drawing from her own experiences as a Latina CEO facing subtle exclusions, she saw in Elijah a mirror of resilience against systemic barriers. At the firm's high-profile ESG Environmental Social Governance Strategy announcement event, held in a packed conference hall with investors and media in attendance, Alyssa stepped onto the stage alongside Elijah. He wore a dark suit tailored by the company, the first time he'd felt truly seen as an equal in that building. The audience murmured as she began. "Today, Frostwell is launching the Labor Integrity Fund, the Elijah Brooks Foundation, to provide scholarships and career development for blue-collar workers with a focus on people of color who face daily discrimination in the workplace. And our first honorary director is Elijah Brooks himself." The hall erupted in a standing ovation, flashes from cameras lighting up the room like fireworks. Elijah approached the microphone, his hands steady despite the spotlight. His voice, though soft, carried weight. "I never wanted to be known. But if anyone's listening who's in a position like mine, a Black man society overlooks. Don't think no one sees you. Someone does. And if you choose what's right, even when discrimination stacks the odds against you, your name doesn't need to be famous to hold real value." The event catapulted the story nationwide, inspiring other companies to establish similar funds and sparking discussions on workplace equity. Elijah became a quiet symbol of integrity, transcending racial barriers. His actions prompting reflections on how invisible labor, especially from people of color, sustains corporate giants. Frostwell's reputation soared, with stock ticking up as investors praised the firm's ethical pivot. For Elijah, it wasn't about the acclaim. It was the validation that his choice, born from silent struggle, had rippled outward, challenging the very biases that had long confined him to the shadows. 2 months later, Elijah still arrived at work before dawn, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty lobby as he began his routine. He mopped the floors with the same steady rhythm, greeted the early birds with his warm, understated smile, and carried on as if nothing had changed. But something profound had shifted not just in him but in the air around him. Now, as he passed through the hallways, people nodded with genuine respect. No longer did they glance away or hurry past. Some stopped to chat, asking about his day or sharing a quick story. A few brought him coffee from the break room, insisting he take a break. Others sought his opinion on the new training programs rolling out through the foundation bearing his name. The security guards, receptionists, and fellow janitors, many of them people of color like him, walked a little taller. They no longer felt like mere shadows in the corporate machine. Elijah's story had illuminated their worth, challenging the subtle discrimination that had long confined them to the margins. One afternoon in the employee lounge, a young white intern approached Elijah as he sat with his packed lunch. The kid, fresh out of college and once oblivious to the maintenance staff, hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Brooks, I just wanted to say, your story is why I decided to stay at Frostwell. I was going to leave for a bigger firm, but seeing what you did owning up when no one would have known, it made me think about integrity differently." Elijah looked up, his eyes kind, and patted the young man's shoulder lightly. "You don't need to be like me, son. Just do what's right even when no one's forcing you to, especially when the world makes it easy to look the other way." The intern nodded, a spark of resolve in his eyes, and walked away with a newfound purpose. Moments like these dotted Elijah's days, now quiet affirmations that his choice had rippled outward, touching lives he never imagined. He still managed the foundation in his off hours, overseeing scholarships that helped blue-collar workers, especially those facing racial barriers, gain skills in tech and advance. Applications poured in from across the country, stories of overlooked talent mirroring his own. Elijah Brooks had never sought fame. He simply wanted to sleep soundly, his conscience clear in a world that often demanded silence from men like him. And perhaps that was the hardest thing, but also the most worthwhile a person could do. For in the end, it wasn't power or money that truly changed the world. It was the quiet honesty of an ordinary man standing firm against invisibility and injustice that sparked a light others could follow.